Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to AAHEE and importantly to Joanne Canales for inviting me to moderate this outstanding panel that we have here. You're in for quite a treat. We have some of the most talented thought leaders in the country on this stage for a conversation on demography, civil rights, and higher education. And I don't want you to think that you're going to be bored because you heard about demography. As I said, we've got some really exciting thought leaders on this stage. Yesterday, as Tom Sáenz pointed out, this is an important and timely topic. Tom talked about the significance of being here in Orange County at this time. How many of you here in this room have heard of Mendes versus Westminster? If you have, please raise your hands. So a pretty good number, but not everyone, maybe about half the room. This case in 1946, 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education was concluded, challenged the separate but equal premise separating Mexican Americans and whites in schools, and established the precedent upon which Brown versus Education was argued. So one of the most important civil rights decisions in US history was built upon a Latino case that was initiated right here in Orange County. So I say that because I want everyone here to know that we have a long and important history in this country. That isn't just starting now with our demographic explosion, but has started before there was the United States as we know it today. So quality education has long been the foundation for equality and mobility, as well as for our economic competitiveness as a nation. It's a civil right, and this right is more important than ever as we head into the greatest economic change our country has experienced since the Industrial Revolution. With the advent of artificial intelligence, automation, and ultimately a tech-enabled world. This is a world that we're going to be left out of if we don't prepare for what's coming. And as Dr. Greaves, who spoke this morning, is helping to prepare us for, and so many others here in this room. The good news is that more Latinos are represented in higher education than ever before. An American Council on Education report that came out just last week said that the US population today is the most educated and racially and economically diverse the US has ever seen. They attribute this in large part to the growth of Hispanic students enrolling in institutions of higher education. Over the past 2 decades, Hispanic enrollment in undergraduate institutions has nearly doubled from 10.3% to 19.8% of all enrolled students. This, while the white share has decreased 17 percentage points in the same period. Unfortunately, increase in numbers does not always equate to increase in success or outcomes. Another important statistic that many of you in this room probably are already familiar with, today 1 in 4 public school students are Latino. And we're expecting, according to the census, by 2060, 38% of students will be Hispanic or Latino. That's nearly 40% of all students by 2060. It's outstanding. What these numbers demonstrate is the outsized impact that Latinos are going to have on our entire society well into the future. For this reason, we must address the persistent inequalities and gaps and foster inclusion and the success rates of our Latinx population across all levels of academia. So this panel boasts the leading demographers of the country who will help us understand what all of this means for our country, but also point to solutions and things that everyone in this room can do, acts that we can take, things we can advocate on behalf of to help address this challenge. So now, to introduce our distinguished panel, I'm going to start with Rogelio Sáenz to my left. Another Sáenz. If you were here last night, we have an abundance of Sáenz. I don't know what magic is in that name.
The signs of the times.
Yes.
Signs of the time.
Rogelio is a sociologist and a demographer, as well as Dean of the College. Did you say you just stepped down?
Stepped down.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was Dean of the College of Public Policy at the University of Texas, Austin.
San Antonio.
San Antonio.
Yeah.
Martin Tienda is...
Marta.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous. You're so outstanding. Marta Tienda is professor of demographic studies, sociology, and public affairs at, wait for it, Princeton University. And David Hayes-Bautista, like Rogelio and Marta, is an overachiever holding multiple roles. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture at UCLA's David Geffen School of Medicine. And I know David through his work with the Latino Donor Collaborative, where they showed, and he showed, that the Latino contributions to the economy, if measured in GDP, would make our contributions equal to the 7th largest country in the world. That's below France and above India. So a little on the format, we're going to have a conversation up here on stage. I'm going to ask some questions of the group. Each of our presenters will present for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we're going to follow up with questions and a conversation, and then we're going to open it to the audience for Q&A. So with that, let's get started. To my left here with you, Rogelio, and for the whole panel, just move down. What are some of the key demographic trends or realities that you're seeing when it comes to Latinos in higher education, and what do they tell us about the greater society and American competitiveness?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Us three demographers, as well as other colleagues around the country, have for some time been talking about these demographic trends that would be coming. We've been doing this for about 3-4 decades. It was clear to us that the day would come when Latinos would be the engine of the US population. And this is already happening. The Latino population has been driving the US demography for the last few decades. It was at that time that demographers were also suggesting that at some point in time in the near future that Latinos would become the majority in places like California, places like New Mexico, places like Texas. And for the most part, that is already here. Demographers were talking about the day where one day it would be Latinos being of critical importance to all of the institutions of the United States, the economy, particularly the K-12 system, as well as higher education, politics, religion, culture, and so forth. And those days that we peered into the future are here. So what we were projecting, and David wrote a very important book along with Jorge Chapa back in 1988, 1989, that was suggesting that at some point in time by 2030 or so, 2020, I think it was, that Latinos would be about 42% of the population, and for the most part, you hit it very effectively. Yet, at the same time that these demographic trends have come to fruition, we continue to have major challenges related to gaining access to the opportunity structure, and that continues to be the case in higher education. In 2011, we became the largest minority group in the country, but yet at the same time, in the higher echelons of higher education, we continue to be underrepresented as students, as faculty and administrators, and so forth. And we also see challenges regarding the political representation of Latinos. For many of us, gaining acceptance as real Americans continues to be a major challenge, particularly in this political climate. We have seen the major pushback related to efforts and ploys to minimize the political representation as well as the demographic strength of Latinos. Just in November in San Antonio, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the civil rights hearings on the status of Mexican Americans, concentrating in Texas and the Southwest. And one of the papers that was commissioned was an overview, demographic and socioeconomic overview that I did. And it shows, again, one of the major growth that has taken place with the Latino population, but at the same time, the gaps that we saw in the late 1960s in education, income, poverty, continue to persist even today. We've advanced in terms of the status, but relatively speaking, with whites, we continue to have major gaps. W.E.B. Du Bois indicated that in the 20th century would be the great divider would be color. Color became the great divider, black, white. In the 21st century, it is increasingly clear that the great division in this country is the intersection of race, color, as well as citizenship. And we see the treatment that immigrants have experienced in this country over the last three decades, but particularly in the last few years with the Trump administration.
Thank you, Rogelio. Marta?
As a demographer, maybe this will sound counterproductive, but I think it's that the Latino presence is undeniable. Nobody's going to challenge that. But group size is not inclusion, nor does it confer political influence. Stated more bluntly, demography is not destiny, because demographic destinies are forged through social policies that broaden the opportunities for social and economic mobility. That's the challenge we face. So demography is a necessary condition, it's not a sufficient condition. The contours of opportunity within which this demographic transformation is taking place have changed dramatically. Baby boomers enjoyed numerous opportunities for social mobility because we came of age during a period of massive expansion in public higher education. And that was because the US was challenged by Russia after the launch of Sputnik. And there was mass participation in higher education that was enabled by Pell Grants, by the GI Bill, and by this expansion in federal funding because we wanted to best the Russians. These investments allowed the United States to become the most educated nation, a status that is now at risk because of underinvestment in higher education. Latinos were a tiny share of the US baby boom generation, of which I'm a part. You can do the math. I'm among the lucky few beneficiaries of these propitious conditions that created myriad pathways to economic and social mobility. How else would the daughter of two Mexican immigrants with less than third grade education be allowed to teach at Princeton University? Latino youth today face several headwinds that are going to interfere with their realizing the higher educational attainment rates that we need as a nation so we can be at that same level of competitiveness that we were in the 70s and the 1980s, and that are commensurate with the baby boom generation that is coming of age, retiring, and leaving a gap in human capital for the nation as a whole when it precisely needs it more. Latino youth, and I'll give you three of these headwinds, are coming of age in an aging society. This generational transition poses formidable challenges for resource allocation between seniors, whose rights and social services are guaranteed in the federal budget, and youth, who are relying on state budgets that have to be balanced every year for their educational investments. Second, Latino youth are coming of age during a period of stagnant social mobility. My generation, we had an 80% chance of earning more than our parents. Youth born in the 1980s have less than a 50% chance of earning more than their parents. And that is because social mobility in the United States has stagnated in ways that have not occurred in other countries. Third, Latinos are coming of age as public education becomes commodified by rising tuition and diminished state support and public funding. MSU tuition, where I attended, has increased 3.7 times in real terms, not in nominal terms, in real terms. And at University of Texas, where I studied for my PhD, the tuition has increased 6.7 times in real terms since I attended. That's not acceptable. What it's doing is squeezing the opportunities for attending at premier public institutions. Bigger cohorts are showing up in attendance numbers. We should be proud of that. That's where demography and destiny are related. But they're not showing up in completion rates. And focusing only on rising presence, on rising enrollment, on rising attendance rates, completion rates even, that they have been rising, deflects attention from the rising gaps, because it's not only Latinos whose presence and whose completion rates are rising, the rates of Asians, whites, and African Americans are rising faster. So if you look at the rates, the gaps have increased. So yes, Latinos are increasing their presence, but presence is not going to generate the economic contributions that we can make as a powerful force in the future. That's why we're here today.
Thank you, Marta. So there are policy challenges, there are economic challenges. We have a perfect storm here of
Onward.
rising numbers with some challenges, and we're going to talk about policy solutions next. But before that, we want to go to David. David, I know you have some more numbers to share with us, and you have some slides. So
okay.
Take it away.
Well, I'd like to talk about some answers. Now, I want to talk about the role of Latinos in science, the real opportunity that we have in front of us. Now, most people say, well, science is objective. You know, you shouldn't make any difference whether the scientist is black, brown, red, or whatever. But let's take a look at this. If you can see these are called social determinants of health, the difference between Latino and non-Hispanic whites. As you can tell, Latinos are 3 times more likely than whites to be uninsured, twice as likely to live in poverty, 7 times more likely not to have graduated from high school. Now, this is a standard model, and if I were to share these data with my colleagues at the David Geffen School of Medicine, and I were to ask them, well, how would this affect Latino health? Most of them would say, it should be terrible. More deaths, more mortality. They're going to smoke more, they're going to drink more, they're going to do drugs more, they're going to have shorter life expectancies. This is the standard model. Now, this is what Kuhn would call, Thomas Kuhn, if you ever read his book on the structure of scientific revolutions, he would say, now this is normal science. We've got all the answers, we've got all the models, we're just going to tamp down a few loose ends. However, what's really important are the anomalies in the data. And how do people get to see the anomalies? So when you see these data on income, education, access to care, by every model this should predict horrible health outcomes for Latinos. Let's look at the data. This is all for California 2013. And in California 2013, Latinos compared to whites age-adjusted had 30% fewer heart attacks, 30% fewer cancers, 10% less strokes, 60% lower chronic lower respiratory disease, and it goes on cause after death, all causes of death 30% lower. Yes, one exception, diabetes. And what's the one thing we all know about Latino health? Diabetes! How come we never know about fewer heart attacks, fewer cancers, fewer strokes? Now, when I share these data, and let me go through a couple more, here is life expectancy at birth. Latinos have a 3.5-year longer life expectancy than whites. I turned 73 last year. Let me tell you right now, those extra 3.5 years look mighty good. And infant mortality, well, actually in California we have really outstanding infant mortality, but Latino and white are very close and way below the national norm of 6 deaths per 1,000 live births. Now, when I show these data to my colleagues, quite often the first thing they say is, that can't be right. Now, I've just shown data. Here's your model, here are the outcomes. It has no explanatory power. And now, if they were scientists, objective, they should say, oh, there's a problem with our model. But the first thing they say is, this can't be right. It doesn't fit the model. Okay. In fact, I shared these data about 1.5 years ago. I was on an NIH panel on race, ethnicity, and genomics and the Precision Medicine Initiative. And I had 3 NIH directors. One of them, well, all 3 of them, their jaws dropped. They saw the data. And one of them said, I've never seen these data before. Where did you get them? I'd tell them, they're your data. I get them from NIH. But the narratives are so strong, they don't see the data. Because after all, how can Latinos ever do anything right? It's part of the narrative. We do everything wrong. Okay, well, here is where the issue of having diversity, to see the anomalies and start to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with these models. So diversity gets you to that first part, but I'll agree with Marta. Diversity is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Because if you have diversity, but they've learned the same models, they've learned to quiet themselves, and they don't say anything, nothing happens. You need diversity with voice to point to the anomalies in the model and say, wait a minute, these data do not sustain your models, they do not sustain your conclusions. Let's iron out these anomalies. Maybe we need new theoretical models. Maybe we need new paradigms. Maybe a state that is 40% Latino actually has a lot going for it. Maybe we should be investing in that. And the interesting thing about voice, and that we do a lot of work on this at UCLA, getting Latinos into the research labs, but developing their voice for better science. Because after all, if your models can't predict the outcomes, the models are no good. And Latinos can help provide better models, better science. If everybody in the United States had the same epidemiological profile as Latinos just for heart, cancer, and stroke, we would save 300,000 lives every year. And they're not Latino lives, we already know how to do it. They'd be largely non-Hispanic white baby boomer lives. That would save more than anything, Affordable Care Act, you name it. This should be the number one item on every medical school's dean's list is, how do Latinos do it? I can assure you it is not. It is not. But we have a new generation of folks going on into medical school, and the best medical students that we have were Latinos who did neuroscience and Chicano studies, molecular biology and Chicano studies. Why Chicano studies? Because that's where they learn to find their voice that they need to take into the research labs to save 300,000 baby boomer lives every year. That is why we need diversity plus voice in the research labs. And if you want these data, they're all in this book I just had last year by University of California Press, La Nueva California, Latinos from Pioneers to Post-Millennials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thanks for that important clarification, because it's very hard to be the only one and still have voice, which is why we do need to push for more inclusion and an inclusion that facilitates and fosters that voice. So thank you for making that very important point. So now I'm going to ask you a question about what stresses you out. What keeps you up at night? What do you worry about in terms of these critical obstacles to Latinx achievement? And we don't have to always go in order. So this time I'm going to start with Marta. And then either of you, whoever feels like you're ready next, can jump in.
So one of the things that really scares me that's taking place right now and how demographic data is being misused is these diversity narratives that talk about the diversity explosion. And that problematizes diversity rather than capitalizes on diversity. So you hear the term, the verb matters. Are we going to manage diversity? Are we going to capitalize on diversity? And these diversity narratives that project diversification of the U.S. population that's been underway for decades, as Rogelio pointed out, has the unintended effect of activating white threat. So the Census Bureau puts out a flyer that says, the white population is shrinking. The whites will be a minority in 20X, and they keep revising that. Well, the question we should say is, who's white? What's whiteness mean? And why does suddenly when Latinos were minority, that it's the way it is. But when whites are minority, it's a big problem, and it activates groups and I think this is one of the big challenges that we need to face, because how demographic data is put out and the framing that takes place is worrisome, particularly in this environment that we're living in. So these composition of these narratives is worrisome, because we've had a couple of rounds with affirmative action. Imagine that affirmative action round taking place today with the court and with these narratives about diversity becoming a problem. So these two forces make it a very difficult problem that the terms of belonging are being redefined in terms of us and them and what is ours and what is theirs. And that is a very divisive narrative that is undermining the mission of the United States as a country that allows for the pluribus to be part of the unum, and the unum requires of the pluribus. We don't all have to be the same, and as David pointed out, if we're all the same, we're like a little robot country. We will not advance scientifically and grow and generate new ideas. So that's one. And the other one is that there's growing evidence that opportunities are being tightly linked with location. There's a growing amount of information that if you live in a low opportunity neighborhood, the longer you spend time, segregated schools, dilapidated neighborhoods with under-resourced environments, the longer that has permanent life course consequences. And that polarization and place and opportunity is something we must do something about, because we are hemorrhaging talent of our young people who are being denied opportunity by being denied access to the kinds of quality schools they need. So that scares me. That's why I'm here today, because I know that you're the next generation that's going to turn this around.
Thank you, Marta. And if you add to that fear of our growing population and what that means, and to go sort of to some of your points, David, about the narratives that are told, and frankly, I would argue the one-sided narratives that were told, not uplifting the contributions that we make. How many of you in here know that Latinos are actually driving small business growth in this country? Okay, a decent number, but not that many. I think maybe I saw 10 hands go up. Latinos start new businesses at 2 to 3 times the rate of any other group in this country. Why is that not a narrative we're hearing much about? So I think we need to keep uplifting these positive narratives, and you gave some great examples before, David. So anyway, who would like to go next?
Let me go. And what would keep me up at night right now is what is happening with the demographic shift, the slowdown of the population growth in the Latino population, but particularly the very slow growth and in some cases decline of the immigrant population. The immigrant population has been a very vibrant force for this country. It has been extremely beneficial for the United States, for whites, for African Americans, for everybody, as well as for Latinos. And Marta had done work back in the 1980s, 1990s that was showing that the success of students, young students, was that tied to an immigrant family, immigrant parents and so forth. So immigrant children, those that were the 1.5 generation of the dreamers, tended to be doing extremely well, much better than expected. And then you find by the time that you're talking about the 3rd and 4th generation, as demographers Eddie Tellez and Vilma Ortiz have shown, you begin to see the decline taking place. Then David's work as well, having to do with the epidemiological paradox, showed that it was really immigrants that were driving that paradox. Immigrants were the ones where you saw that were really the ones that had the low mortality rates, the long life expectancy, because for the 3rd generation, 4th generation Latinos, they became more like the regular kind of Americans that didn't have that advantage. Yeah. And I see in this demographic shift that is occurring right now in the United States, the borders, the walls and everything to block, as well as the deportation, people being deported, detained and so forth, we're going to lose that vibrancy, those ganas that people were coming to this country, succeeding in the educational system, being the valedictorians of their high schools and so forth, going off to college and so forth, and bringing some of that rise of the increase in the educational attainment of Latinos, as well as that health kind of structure. What it was, la magia, what the pill that the immigrants were taking or whatever to improve their health outcomes. With these kinds of trends, if they become long-term, the question is, are we going to lose that particular kind of advantages that we have had?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, immigrants drive new business, immigrants drive the economy, and immigrants contribute. We know that. So it's really unfortunate that we've had this tide turning against the engines of the richness of our country. And it's not just Latinos, right? You know, it is Latinos and other immigrants too. David.
Well, luckily we've been through this before. I mean, we've had a wave of immigration. That group of immigrants has had children, and now they're showing up in the college campuses. In California, this was the 8th time this has happened. There have been, since 1769, not 1, not 2, but 8 waves of immigration from Mexico to Alta California, on about 30-year cycles approximately. Now, the first 2 cycles, we were just part of Mexico. We were simply a regional variant of Mexican identity, society, and culture. But suddenly, in 1848, in the space of 10 days, was what I call the Latino Big Bang. Okay, I mean, we've been happily a part of Mexico up until then. Suddenly, on January 24th, they discover gold, James Marshall. 10 days later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo takes effect, and suddenly Latinos, the Spanish-speaking society that had been part of Mexico, goes in a different direction to create what I call the civil society, the bilingual, bicultural civil society of Latinos de Estados Unidos. Tens of thousands of Latinos arrived during the gold rush. That was a wave. When France invaded Mexico, thousands more of refugees, political refugees, left France, came to California. That's why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo, by the way. Yeah. It is our experience of the American Civil War. We saved the United States with the victory at the Battle of Puebla. Then, after Reconstruction, you had another wave of immigration just at the time of Plessy v. Ferguson, the American Protective Association. Then World War I, La Revolución, we had the sixth wave. Now, usually this is where Chicano history starts. Oh, the Mexican Revolution, there was nothing here before. We had Cinco de Mayo. We built this state, and it goes on. What worries me is we don't know that. We've forgotten that. That, for me, is the thing that keeps me up awake at night is, as Latinos, we do not have our own narrative of ourselves in this country. There's no narratives. We're kind of, no somos ni de aquí ni de allá. Okay, quick, I have a question for the audience. Name me the oldest continuously inhabited city of the United States.
A few.
Which? San Agustin?
I heard St. Augustine, Santa Fe, and Santa Cruz. Those were the three I heard.
San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Epa!
Ah, we don't have our own narrative. And that is what keeps me awake, because how do we deal with ourselves? How do we find our voice? How do we take our voice into academia, into the research laboratories, if we don't own our own narrative? And I will tell you, it is not there.
Yep.
But we have the capacity to do it. We now have the departments of ethnic studies, Chicano studies. We try to bring this into the sciences, into medicine. People always wondered back in the 70s and the 80s when we formed the National Chicano Health Organization, why do you guys have to be separatist? Right. We weren't separatists. We were trying to find our own voice, which we did, and we created an alternative health system, which we did, the community clinic system of California. And we're the major healthcare providers. We signed up more people on Obamacare than any other entity in California, and nobody knows about it. We don't have our own narrative. That is what keeps me up.
Can I just add to that? California's initial constitution was penned in Spanish and in English.
Bravo.
The revision is in English only. That is not okay. But most people don't know that initially it was penned in Spanish and in English. So these histories, when I was on the recruitment team at Princeton, well, we hired a Latina, for Latino history, because that was on the map. And what I learned is that this is a nascent field. Why is the origin of the nation a nascent field? Right? It's not just saying we were here first. It's understanding that nascent history that has been pushed into the background as if it didn't occur. And you see this also in the movie Lone Star, where there's this discussion of what you should include in the textbook and how you tell what happened at the Alamo. So these histories have to be put back, and it is the people in this room who are going to do that, because it is the leadership of higher education that's going to filter back to the primary schools and the secondary schools to make sure that our history is not left out. When in the third grade lab school, my son's teacher said, we're going to teach history, American history up to the Civil War. And I sit in the room and I said, excuse me, are you going to cover the Mexico-US war? And he said, I said, it occurred first before the before the Civil War. He said, no, we don't have time. Well, you know what? The time has come.
Bravo.
And if this is not the Hispanic movement, and if it's not you, then who? And if it's not now, then when? So we have a mission to do to get the voice back. It is not about numbers, it's about the voice. Well, and we're not singing it either.
Well said, well said. So I could be here, we could all be here for a really long time talking about this stuff. It's so exciting. I wish we had more time. I want to drive to some solutions. I don't want us to all think about all the challenges and problems, although you elevated a solution Marta, about what we can do with the people in the room. We do need to tell our history. We need to uplift the positive narratives. But what are some other solutions, policy solutions, recommendations, and actions that those in this room can take to address some of the challenges that we've uplifted? Just one. And I'm going to start with Rogelio.
Okay, I think, again, demography, the demographic piece here is the children in the Latino population. We have every year 1 million Latino children turn age 18. These are the potential voters, and it is really the engaging of Latino youth. And we see kind of the shifts that are taking place from these groups. As Marta points out, you have the rise of the leaders of the future. We see it right now with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the noise she's making, the voice that she's putting. And among these kids that are turning 18 every year, there's 1 million kids that are turning 18 every year. There's where our future is.
Thank you for that. And that's the issue with voting and not teaching civics in our schools is a huge issue.
I agree. That's ballot box is an important one, and it does make a difference. We've seen it, and it's the young people who have turned around some elections. One of the things that I think is really urgent, just urgent, is to restore public funding for public institutions so that college becomes affordable, and to put in the supports that are necessary. It's not negotiable because the future of the country rests on that. And unfortunately, the state support for public education has been diminishing over time. And that means that the expected family contribution has increased over time. And that has put a squeeze on the working class. Now, we don't use that word anymore. We should use the word, that word, because that's exactly what Ivanka Trump said. American people want workers. They want to work for something. They don't want nothing. And Cortez said, yes, I've worked for wages and tips, so I understand. It's not theoretical for me. So we have to put this back so that working people like my family could actually afford to go to college. Not to do that means that education, public education, financed through public funds, has become a private good. The public has to take back public education. If you want private education, you can pay $50,000 to Harvard and Princeton. But if you want a public education, it should be affordable for the general population, for the total public, so that the public institutions will represent their states in demographics and economics, and not just those who can afford to pay. For me, that is the critical solution, and that becomes a matter of public will, political will, and get the right people to run those states.
Thank you, Marta. David?
The power of narratives is very strong, as we see today. We have a president who will say any lie any number of times a day about Latinos, and his base believes it because it fits their narrative, what they quote-unquote know about Latinos. And they've known it here ever since 1848. We're all criminals, we're not Americans, we're lazy, blah, blah, blah. And it fits. So even though there's no data, it's what they want to hear. We need our own narrative, and I hope to God we make it data-based. We don't need to make up anything. We've got a wonderful base to start with. But we do have to develop our own narrative so that our kids go through, they develop their voice, so that we become not just the world's 7th largest economy, we be the 6th, the 5th. France is going backwards. Britain's breaking up. Without doing anything, we're going to move up a couple. But we could really move over because the growth in the GDP of the United States is being driven by Latinos, because we're that really dynamic piece. And I will agree 1,000% with Marta. I went to UC. I graduated from UC Berkeley. I paid $108 a year.
Wow.
Okay. My son graduated from UC San Diego 5 years ago. He's carrying $90,000 worth of student debt before he can do anything else. And when people say, well, it's impossible to have free education, I go, wait, the baby boomers got it. Gee, what's wrong with that? Of course, baby boomers are 90% white in this state. Gee. And here in this state, they got their property taxes capped in 1978, so they don't have to pay property taxes anymore.
Wow.
And now they're getting Social Security and Medicare.
Yep.
And all we want is free education. Just to give you one just notion of how tight this shoe is pinching, we have a tremendous Latino physician shortage here in California. It is so bad that at the current rate that all the medical schools in California, public and private, graduate Latino physicians, I have to tell you, we are right now short 54,000 Latino physicians for Latinos to have the same access. Oh, there are 7,000 Latino physicians. We're short 54,000. It will take all the schools, this is for 2015, all the schools 500 years to graduate Latino physicians to make up the shortage for 2015. I can just see it now. Senora Gomez, please take a seat. The doctor will see you in, 500 years. Whoa. Now, if we were to double Latino enrollments, and that's going to take a lot of pushing and shoving, okay, 250 years. We actually did the math. If every single seat of every year of every medical school in California occupied by Latinos, we could finally make up that deficit in only 49 years. And other people would say, that would be so unfair to everybody else. So it's okay for Senora Gomez to wait for 500 years? The power of narratives.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Okay, so now,
Can I just say something?
now we need to go
I just want to say
really,
one
really,
thing
really,
that-
really quickly.
Yeah, you know what? We have, I don't want to say that the young versus the old, but since we have a lot of young people here, I will. There is the organization called AARP, American Association for Retired People. You try to mess with Medicare or Social Security, they're all over you, and you're not going to get anywhere. I don't care what political party you're from. But we don't have an equivalent American Association for Young People. Imagine if we did have somebody to give voice to the young people about their future and about their investments. That's all I
That's
want to
an
say.
excellent point. That's an excellent point. Okay, so now we're going to open up to the audience for Q&A, and we are not going to do mic running because we want to get as many questions in as we can. So there are people on there's one person with a mic on the left of the room and one on the right, depending on your perspective. That's the opposite. Just walk over to the mic person on the left or the right of the room. Lift up your hand so everyone can see you. And just walk over so you can ask a question if you have one. So I'm going to start right over here, my left, your right.
Hello, my name is Alberto Rocca. I run a nonprofit that works on faculty diversity called minoritypostdoc.org. So you're preaching to the choir. I agree completely about the importance of voting and the importance of education, but the media and entertainment reach a larger public audience than those two previous institutions, and yet shows with Latino narratives, like One Day at a Time, struggle to find an audience, struggle to find resources. So could you comment on how media and entertainment could raise our narratives, but then how we also need to support them? Thank you.
Good question.
Well, you're working with the Latino Donor Collaborative, and this is precisely probably the main focus of the Latino Donor Collaborative, is working either with or against or in spite of Hollywood to change the narratives about Latinos. And it's not just at the executive producer or the scriptwriter, all the way down to the showrunners and everything else. There is a huge lack of interest in Latino narrative because talk to the actors. They go out to try out for parts and they're always, you don't look Latino enough. You don't sound Latino enough. And these are Latino actors. Again, there's a narrative of what is a Latino supposed to be like. So it's going to take pressure. I'd invite you to go to the website of the Latino Donor Collaborative. They're having a meeting next week, and once again, they're bringing in producers and they're talking with them. Not trying to beat them up, but having them understand, for Pete's sake, we buy 25% of all movie tickets, and we way disproportionately buy movie tickets. Why can't we have a movie that we can be that we show up in? I think Roma was the first step.
Can I say, there's ways to use the media for education. So I'm sure some of you saw the film Hidden Figures. That was produced, that was based on the book that was sponsored by the Sloan Foundation, on whose board I serve and chair. Because we have a program called Public Understanding of Science. And they try to get that out. The other one, so nobody said, well, God, nobody knew about that. No, it wasn't in anybody's interest to know that they were all the computers. They were African American. And Hedy Lamarr, her work was the basis for the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and all the things we take for granted. She was an actress. But nobody took her for, they wrote her off because she was beautiful. There are a lot of women here who are trying to find their voice as well. And Hedy Lamarr got a patent for this that would interfere with the torpedoes during World War II. The US Navy filed it, so she never got her due. That's another secret that we tried to expose through media and through public understanding of science. So the media can be our friend, but it has to be given the information and the narrative and the audiences. So how you package the narrative for people to discover is an important. So it's not to be written off. There is a way to find it, and if we can't find the solution, then somebody's going to find one that's different from ours.
And did you have another thing to add to that? Okay. And I would also just argue that we do have to start to come together and unite our voice, and also demand, as the African American community has, demand representation in our movies, demand representation behind the camera, demand that our scriptwriters and our producers get on there, and then also get outraged when these negative narratives about us happen. I had a convening recently, and we kind of collectively looked at ourselves and said, how is it that this president can be talking about us the way that he is without any repercussions? I mean, imagine Al Sharpton would be all over it.
Him. Yes.
I've been told we only have time for one more question. So we're going to go to this side of the room over here. I'm not able to hear you. Can we turn the mic on? If you speak really loudly, I'll try and repeat the question for the audience.
No.
Come on up, come on up, come on up.
One of our democracy students at UTSA.
Please.
That one works.
Go ahead.
Can I speak here? Okay.
Yes, you can. And if nobody can hear, I'll repeat it.
So we've been talking a lot about the lack of Latino representation in higher education. And David, you talked a lot about the importance of narrative, right? And then you three were all asked about your fears in the context of like demographic change. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about my own fears. And what keeps me up at night is the lack of diversity in demography, in the field of demography. And so I was wondering if you three could speak about some of the initiatives that you all have taken, or your institutions have taken, to diversify the field of demography on every essential dimension of identity.
That's a great question.
Well, Marta when you had an effort with demography to bring institutions, PhD institutions, which we were one of those, UTSA, and tried, but then the funding was short-lived.
So that's exactly the problem. So the Population Association of America, and I was a president of the association in 2002, but this happened afterwards, and they wanted me to chair a committee later to say, how can we diversify the pipeline into demography as a field of study. And so we talked about the way that the NSF and other institutions have been trying to diversify minority pipelines in specific disciplines. And so they said, okay, we have $20,000 or 30, whatever it was. It was not how many institutions. We worked with North Carolina because they were trying to do it at the Population Center. And I said, well, let me call my friends. And I called UTSA because I knew that Joachim and you were there. And they were, and said, can we try to cultivate this process? And we did, and we got some started. But you can't. This is not an event. It's a process. Yep. A pipeline is not a segment. It's an entire generation and successive generations, successive cohorts. You can't do it one time and expect things to change, and that's what was so, you know, that's worse. That's what I call the revolving door. You raise expectations and then they fall. That said, there are other programs that I find that we could replicate, like the one that Tapia has at Rice University. They graduate more people in math and science and engineering and PhDs because there is a sustained commitment that's supported at the top. The tone is set at the top when an institution is committed to making these changes. And if it little things from the bottom, they'll perk up. It's like throwing beans, at the birds on the street. What we want to do, it has to start at the top, and it has to be maintained and sustained over time. And when Ruth Simmons was president in a Brown university. I had the privilege of serving with her on her board. The recession hit, and they were going to do what we call organizational re-evaluation, which means we're going to be cutting and reconstructing. And what Ruth said to the board is, financial aid is not on the table. We have worked to bring that to the fore. We may have to do some cutting. We're not cutting where we've struggled so much, because this is our way of diversifying our pool and having Brown be one of the institutions that is contributing to the future cohorts, the diversity of the nation, not just who can afford to pay. And that is where we all have a responsibility as educational leaders to make sure that we don't allow whoever we're reporting to say, well, that has to cut. Those special programs are mainstream programs. They are not special.
Ladies and gentlemen, I told you were going to be excited and entertained. Do we want these folks back? Really, we have to work a way to get, this as part of the curriculum and the workshops and the sessions, because the whole idea of understanding how to get our voice is important. I'm from the media. Okay, I've been a TV reporter, public affairs director, documentary filmmaker. I know what it takes, and we don't have it yet as a community. So finding our voice has to be the #1 priority. The narrative has to start skewing in our direction, and you are the first line of offense in that process, because you're going to be influencing students. Let's give these folks a big hand.